Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good, just waiting for the slides to come up. I'm going to present some of the work and thinking that we've been doing within the policy processes theme in future agricultures, and particularly as we've thought about the CAADP process, which remains a central feature of the African agricultural policy landscape. Again, I'd like to start by giving apologies for Blessings, who was due to be here and actually was due to be doing this talk rather than me. So I'm really sorry about his family circumstances, but he can't be with us. In our policy processes work recently, we've done 2 or 3 things. We started off looking at 8 different countries in Africa and trying to just understand what are the political incentives for agricultural policy making in Africa at a really high level. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon when we present the special issue of Development Policy Review, which has come out of that first phase of work. We then took some of our understanding of those political incentives and said, well, how has that influenced what has happened in the CAADP processes in these countries, and what value added CAADP has brought in these countries, and what are ways forward for CAADP in the light of that. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. We then, some of us from Future Agricultures, mainly from the policy processes theme, got involved in a study commissioned by the Africa Union Commission, Firetail here in London, led on this study where we looked at drivers of success in African agriculture in a way to bring political insights into their review of what's been going on. Now, it's not primarily my intention to talk about that, though I'll mention it a bit later. And as John has said that I'll talk about successes, you may have questions about that, even if I don't talk about it much. And we have done other things like the conference, which John talked about. I'm going to assume, as I talk, that most people are reasonably familiar with the CAADP process. John's already talked about it. We have one of our working papers, which is what I'm going to talk to today, and several country studies downloadable from our website. Some copies of this are available next door. So we've already mentioned the Maputo Declaration in 2003, where African heads of state committed to policies and investments to achieve 6% annual growth in agriculture. They committed to putting 10% of national budgets into agriculture policies as a sign of their political commitment to this and to enable it to happen. And they also committed to engagement in this comprehensive Africa agricultural development program process. In fact, the process in country only emerged in the few years after Maputo, but they committed to engage in some sort of CAADP process as a way of enhancing the quality of national agricultural planning and policy making to try and enable them to reach their targets. And we know that many African countries have now in some way or other gone through this so-called CAADP process, but only maybe 7, certainly a minority of countries, have consistently achieved their 10% national budget share over the year, and very few have achieved the 6% growth target, although this was always very ambitious, as Steve will tell us, if you look historically, achieving 6% per annum agricultural growth. Nigeria, Ethiopia are close. I think, well, 3.2%, I think, wasn't it? It's where we are. So let me just start then with this slide here, which is a quote in the preamble to the declaration that African heads of state made in June this year, where they reiterated their basic commitment to supporting African agriculture, and they recommitted to the 10% budgetary target, and they added various other things in their commitments to supporting agriculture in the decade ahead. But I found this quote very interesting. They recognise the challenges faced in the implementation of many prior decisions and declarations, in particular on progress made in attaining the minimum targets of public investment in agriculture that should demonstrate Africa's ownership and leadership to the achievement of goals as enshrined in the 2003 Maputo commitments. And in the CAADP process, we have this very interesting tension. One of its strengths is it's presented as African-led and African-owned. Actually, in many countries, it is received as something that comes from outside. It also started very clearly as African-led and African-owned, but actually as more donor money came behind it, that element of it got mixed a little bit as well. But it still has this sense this is an African process and that's one of its strengths. But while saying that their commitment should demonstrate African ownership and leadership to what they're doing, they realise they haven't actually provided the ownership and leadership that they should have done, or many of them haven't yet. And this political commitment is one of the key issues. And then the question for CAADP as it goes forward in the next 10 years is, if we actually identify that the domestic political commitment in many of these countries to drive agricultural growth is limited, well, let's say it's a glass half empty on this one. Let's say it's limited. What can something like CAADP do to try and increase the incentives for good policy and investment for African agriculture? And that's what we'll try and talk about. I've put up two slides here of hypotheses that we started out with when we were thinking about CAADP, and we'd identified in the first phase of our work that we had countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda, which we characterised as having rather strong incentives for good agricultural policy. And these are countries where broad-based growth is critical for either regime survival or for other objectives. For example, in Rwanda, it seems that the leadership have realised strategically that critical to ensuring a secure future for the Tutsis in the country is to ensure that prosperity is achieved for all. Okay? And therefore, broad-based growth is absolutely critical to everything they do, and they are in a hurry to achieve it. In many other countries where you can't identify some sort of overriding driver like that, actually, although rural and smallholder households are often still in the majority in the population, actually the pressure that they bring to bear on policymakers is still quite weak, and the incentives for strong agricultural policy are not as good as they ought to be. So in where we found strong political incentives, so I say we started off with countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia in our mind, we hypothesized that they would probably embrace CAADP, seeking the value added and the funding available for it. But because of what we knew about these regimes, they probably wouldn't score particularly highly on participation of non-state actors or accountability in the process. Where in the countries where there are what we identify as rather weaker political incentives, that they would likely make slow or halting process with CAADP implementation. That actually what they did might be more of a box-ticking exercise as donors came on board, or to be able to say to other fellow leaders that they'd done it. And again, we weren't expecting any real shift in political incentives. Now, a couple of important caveats there. First of all, we were only formulating these in 2012. They're not entirely ex-ante hypotheses. We had some understanding of things that had happened already, but we were trying to rationalize that, and some things were still to play out after we formulated the hypotheses. The second thing to say is there are real issues, and this is at the heart of trying to evaluate something like CAADP, is the attribution question. How can you say what would have happened without CAADP? And that is a really difficult question to answer. However, our hypothesis is saying that actually there are these different political drivers within the countries either way tend to say that the impacts and value addition of CAADP are likely to be more modest than if we didn't take these things into account. So in other words, even in the countries where we see an apparently very strong CAADP story, quite a lot of it might have happened anyway because the domestic political drivers were pushing it. So we didn't start out saying we were going to expect big impacts from CAADP, and indeed that's really what the conclusions we came to. I hope you can read that. In Rwanda, first country to go through the process of a CAADP compact, and actually around the same time, the share of public expenditure in agriculture, public expenditure on the agricultural sector really started to go up from having only been 3 or 4%. What started going up quite rapidly, came to 10 or even more than 10% now. So timing-wise, it fits very nicely with CAADP. What exactly was the causality? What was going on? Well, the government had always said it was serious about agriculture, but it hadn't actually turned that into action in its first, well, certainly in the first 10 years after the genocide. The initial years were stabilization and peace. Then there was a period in the early 2000s where the emphasis was on social sector spending plus the IT revolution they were trying to bring, and a lot of expenditure was urban. And it was only around 2006 when the national poverty figures came out and they realized they were just not making any progress on poverty as they'd expected. They'd better get into agriculture. President Kagame seems to have been convinced about this. And CAADP was a very convenient vehicle at this point to try and convince others, both within the country and possibly even within the donor community, because they'd been very much behind the social sector spending, that we should prioritize agriculture. President Kagame was a strong supporter of NEPAD. He had a NEPAD coordination unit already in his office of the president, and he worked with them and the Ministry of Agriculture and used CAADP as a way of actually saying we want to prioritize agriculture more. And part of the deal is when you do your stock taking exercise, as you're preparing your documentation, there's some support that's available, including modeling support provided by IFPRI, which was able to say, if you increase your agricultural growth rates, these are the benefits you might expect in your economy. And this was found to be genuinely helpful in making the case to others within Rwanda that we need to raise agriculture up the agenda. So exactly where CAADP comes in. CAADP was very useful. Was it actually the driver for the changes that take place? Well, we see it more as a very convenient vehicle that was available in Rwanda at the time when President Kagame and those close to him needed it. Quite a lot of our other case studies are, there's a little less to show. Malawi, the story that Blessings would tell much more eloquently than I can if he was here, was of donors hoping that the CAADP process and the discussions around it and the bringing in the non-state actors to discuss agricultural policy would create some new space for dialogue on composition of agricultural expenditure in the country. And in Malawi, the context is that you had from 2005-6, you'd had the agricultural, the farm input subsidy program, which Andrew will talk about a bit this afternoon, which had very positive impacts on food production in the country, but had really come to dominate policy making and expenditure. And even things like extension, which could add value to the subsidy program, if it could assist farmers to make more efficient use of the subsidized fertilizer and other inputs that they were getting. Even extension expenditure was being squeezed. Extension staff were being, their time was going very much on the subsidy program. So a sense of how can we put this in a broader context and have a balance of public goods expenditure and subsidy. But actually, the story that Blessings tells is that the CAADP process was not able really to achieve much of a rebalancing. And when you get to the investment program in Malawi, more than 70% of the expenditure that was envisaged as part of that was either the subsidy program or something called the Greenbelt Initiative. And there wasn't really much of a rebalancing. In Tanzania, there had been some sort of tension within the policy process anyway between the agricultural sector development strategy, which was worked out with donors, and was the way that the sector was officially proceeding in terms of its investment. There was quite a lot of emphasis on irrigation in there, but various other things as well. And then just before the 2010 election, you got something called Kilimo Kwanza, which was more of a sort of political campaigning tool, but what did have some resonance in the country, but had in detail quite different emphasis from the agricultural sector development strategy. And it had some indigenous private sector, politically well connected, support behind it, and there was quite a lot of emphasis actually on slightly larger farms and agribusiness in the Kilimo Kwanza, even though it had a populist front to it. And so these two things were somewhat in tension, and actually the CAADP process came in, and rather than resolving any of those debates or discussions about what's really going on in the policy-making sphere, just added another umbrella over the top, another set of acronyms under which both of these other two, were somehow supposed to fit in, and didn't really deal with anything much of substance. There's been, and actually when they then went to the CAADP people to say, is our new thing, which is called TAFSIP, is this going to be CAADP compliant? Or no, is our agricultural sector development strategy going to be CAADP compliant? Can we use that as our CAADP vehicle? There were 32 things that needed to be added to ensure it covered the whole range of pillars of CAADP. So you ended up with an augmented ASDS thing called TAFSIP, which had even less prioritization than most of the existing strategy documents that we see in Africa. So it's not clear that it added anything at all in that context, and it does seem to be much more of a box-ticking exercise. The experiences from our country studies on participation of civil society and private sector actors, one way where you might hope to get some change in policy, find that it's been fairly token in most of these countries. The one exception potentially being Burkina Faso, where actually initially these players weren't involved at all. The donors said to the government, you should bring them into the consultations, and they do seem to have been able to have some shift on, at least emphasis on land policy within the documents. But otherwise, it's hard to find cases of real change resulting from their non-state actors being involved in the process. And even in the countries where there seems to be some commitment to bring these players in, the interviews that my colleagues have done for the country studies with people in government say, well, their capacity to actually have a serious contribution to the policy debates is quite limited. And those are the more optimistic stories where people have some starting goodwill to bring them in. In other countries, it's just not really that interested in bringing them in at all. We conclude from our sort of review of the processes that actually prescribing a process for each country to follow has had somewhat limited benefits. The Tanzania case being a classic example, you get clashes with existing processes which have already been going on in the country, which may have been as participatory as the CAADP process was. You get some duplication of processes. At best, you get a repackaging of an existing strategy now as the CAADP one, but potentially with institutional conflicts because one ministry or agency was primarily driving the existing strategy, and now somebody else associated with that AU or NEPAD is charged with producing the CAADP one. And even some donors initially felt they'd invested heavily in existing strategy development processes and thought, well, you know, why are we having now to go through this whole process again? We've already got one. So our sort of conclusion going forward is, rather than prescribing a process, is that having some clear principles for what a good policy process should look like and some sort of mutual accountability, which is very much in the original spirit of NEPAD, as to whether what you've done in your country, whether what we've done in our country actually meets those good practice, and being a bit public about that would be better than saying these are the specific steps that you have to take. The other comment that we've observed on this is that in the first years, pretty much up to now, it's just as we're getting into joint sector review implementation in these countries, up to fairly recently, most of the emphasis in the CAADP process has been on planning. Arguably, the two big issues should have been prioritisation. Plans tended to have been wish lists, and as I say, in the Tanzania case, the CAADP process hasn't made that any better. Prioritisation at the planning stage, and then implementation of what has already been agreed. And CAADP has started at the planning stage rather than focusing on implementation, and we'll see how joint sector reviews get on. But really, it's the implementation of what's on paper that's as big a challenge as what goes on the paper in the first place. I guess in the light of that, we need to say why continue with this, if its impacts were initially limited. We do, in our team, come up with a positive answer. I hope we're not just saying what we think our stakeholders want to hear. That, as Steve was saying in the earlier presentation, there really are big opportunities for African agriculture at the moment, and rising domestic demand is the first and most important, but then there are other global opportunities and threats. High world food prices is actually a political threat to African countries that are heavily dependent on food imports, but it's an economic opportunity for domestic agriculture. Steve also started talking about this towards the end in response to questions in his session, is that quite a lot of the growth that we've seen in African agriculture is a result of creating generally better conditions, removing the taxation that Julian was asking about, firstly through removing overvaluation of exchange rates, but then there may be some direct taxation of agriculture that's going on, and removing that, creating a political climate, Ghana being a good example of this, where people are confident that policy is not going to suddenly change and undermine the investments that they've made in agriculture. They will be allowed to get on with their business. Markets will function relatively freely, and they can make money out of it. So getting that enabling environment, not perfect, but better, a lot better than it was, has been quite an important part of the growth story. When we then get into what have governments done beyond that has specifically contributed to rapid growth in their countries, probably in the cases like Rwanda and Ethiopia, where, as I say, we found particularly strong incentives to see growth faster and to learn from what's happening and to make changes, yes, we probably can come up with quite a number of examples. If you take somewhere like Ghana, it gets a bit more difficult. There have been yield increases in some key crops and yield increase, productivity-driven growth rather than area-driven growth is more likely to be associated with the poverty reduction and other outcomes we're looking for. What has the government actually done to assist in this yield-driven growth rather than area-driven growth? Well, there has been some good research going on. You then look at whether the systems are in place to get those new technologies out to farmers, and you find that often those systems are incredibly weak. And it's only where donor projects have come in and taken particular new varieties which seem very promising, and they have funded the dissemination campaigns, often using state extension agents, but it's a donor money and it's a donor drive for outcomes which is actually causing these things to happen. Then varieties have got out and have been associated with yield increases. There are real weaknesses in African state systems for actual delivery of key services like extension, and you find that the political pressures lead to investment expenditure over recurrent expenditure, and recurrent expenditure, well, no, investment expenditure is a priority, and within recurrent expenditure, salaries take most of it. Operational expenditure is consistently squeezed, so service delivery is a real problem. So there are definitely systemic weaknesses in many African states for proactively doing things that would stimulate African growth beyond the creation of the general enabling environment. And if African governments are going to address that, it is going to need strong political commitment, because there are systemic changes that have to be made within African states. And the CAADP process is sort of uniquely placed, if anything is going to have an impact on this. It's established on the African agricultural policy scene, and it has its ability through the African Union to access heads of states, ministers of agriculture, finance, and hopefully help them to change their practice. I think I have a couple more slides to go. So, what potential does something like CAADP have for leverage where political incentives are weak domestically, or value addition where actually there are already strong incentives to do things? I've talked a little bit about the importance of leadership if you have got big changes that have to be made in state systems and patterns of expenditure. And it does seem that where heads of state could be identified as having some sort of personal commitment to AU processes, to Pan-African vision, to NEPA, to African Union, it has made some difference even in whether their commitments on agriculture were met or not. Having the heads of state recommit this time, so it's new heads of state, it's a decade on, actually saying, no, the direction of travel which was agreed 10 years ago is still relevant, and we still think it's important, and implicitly you should be able to question us about whether we're doing it. That's actually quite a positive step. Again, say what Steve said about the Asian experience, 40 years of moving steadily, not spectacularly, in the same direction, actually recommitting for a second decade. Our predecessors, not us, said this was important. We haven't yet achieved it, but this is still where we're going, is a positive thing. And the new generation can put their own additional bells and whistles on that, but the basic commitment is reiterated. That's good. What then can CAADP do? We identify information brokering. This can be of two forms. One is sort of formal analysis of what works, and there are really key things for CAADP to be, key messages for CAADP to be trying to get across to ministers of agriculture, and when they do meet heads of state, but primarily ministers of agriculture, on the balance of expenditure and making sure that key public goods are properly funded. The 10% money is not all going on subsidies. Benefits are supporting smallholder growth within that. Steve talked about that a bit. CAADP has access to present key findings from this, key evidence from this to people who matter. And then high-level networking, when ministers of agriculture and others get together, there are really interesting conversations that go on in these meetings, including discussions about reforming ministries of agriculture. And one minister of agriculture saying to another, I'm so jealous that you were able to get your ministry reformed. I have to work with what I've got, and the political conditions are not enabling me to do that. But talking about what they are managing to do that is making a difference. Those conversations are happening at these events. More equally importantly, accountability. Accountability is still a general weakness in many African contexts, but CAADP, if it pushes hard enough, should be able to make common expenditure data available, not just to researchers to analyze it, but for civil society and other groups to lobby about. And so far, we have an issue where we have a 10% target where we don't even have a standard definition of what fits within that 10%. It varies across countries. And the data on what was budgeted might become available, but it's not readily available across countries. There's quite a lot of sort of going around doing your research to try and draw it together. The expenditure on actuals, far more difficult to get together. Have a commitment that if we're serious about this, we present on an annual basis in a standardized format the data on our actual expenditure under standardized CAADP headings for agriculture. And then not only can researchers work on it, but civil society can lobby about it. Having said that, our view on civil society participation is it's not a magic bullet. I've talked a bit about that already. It's important for there to be policy spaces, but on their own, civil society groups who participate in these spaces are not linked to sort of strong movements outside of those policy spaces that can bring any credible pressure to bear on the decision makers within those spaces. And until that becomes more the case, they can just be, their participation can be token in those things because they haven't really got any leverage they can exert over policymakers. I was asked to say something about policy engagement. As I say, as Future Agricultures, we have participated in a study which was one that went to the African Union Commission, was used heavily with heads of state prior to the Malabo Declaration. The main thing that the African Union Commission took out of it was that we'd done some political analysis of why some countries were doing better than others on their agriculture, and without them necessarily having to agree on everything we said, just the message that they could take to heads of state that you can't just come here, sign up to a commitment, and sit back and blame the technocrats if the targets are missed. The countries that are performing well have shown political leadership in these areas. And this is a political issue, guys. You know, are we up for this? That's really, I think, how they used it. And then there are all sorts of further discussions to go on. We have the Malabo Declaration. Actually, there quite a lot of the things that are actually going to happen over the next 10 years are still to be mapped out. There will be more said at the next Heads of State meeting early next year. There are discussions at the moment, ActionAid and others are working with African Union Commission, for example, on saying, you know, what should be classified in the 10%? Come on, we need to have a standard definition and we need to have data availability that's much better so that people can look into this. And we hope to be part of that discussion as part of what we've done. I think my time's up, so let me stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Colin.